Massive cuts as the nation celebrates 50 years since Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. A new survey shows just who is being affected by the new voter ID laws. And amid the voting rights battle, President Obama gets ready to speak at a ceremony honoring the March on Washington. How does he address all of this? Those are today's topics for our agenda panel. Dade is a contributing editor for The Root. Reilly is a justice reporter for the Huffington Post. Guys, it's good to have you here. And let's start with the new analysis that we have coming in from voting in 2012, exactly who was most disenfranchised, because according to this new survey from the Advancement Project, we have racial minorities being the most affected by these voter ID laws, along with veterans, Americans with disabilities, and students. So, Corey, let's talk about this. Is that being taken into consideration as we look at certain states that are now imposing these stricter voter ID laws? As we've been talking about, it seems as if they're constantly seeking a solution for a problem that doesn't exist.
Well, Thomas, there is no evidence that voter fraud is occurring with any statistical significance in any state. I think what you're seeing, though, over the last 2 years is when these laws are challenged in court, judges are taking into account those who are affected, but also taking into account what each state does in an effort to make sure individuals get a chance to get these new photo IDs. That was the hang-up last year with Pennsylvania. The judge decided that the state had not made enough effort to make sure that these new photo IDs were free or easily accessible. In Texas, that was one of the death knells that ended this effort last year. So I think what you're going to see with DOJ challenging Texas's voter ID law and some other laws is that they already have rulings in the Texas case from last year against voter ID and Texas's redistricting law that showed that both these laws were discriminatory against minorities. That will actually help potentially the DOJ's case to strike down these laws. Okay, and Irin Carmon, who's an MSNBC national reporter, joins us in the conversation as well. Irin, when you hear what Corey is saying about that and potentially helping the DOJ's case, is that a possibility that example will help their case? Because now we have Texas, we've got North Carolina. We're going to be watching all these efforts ramp up now that the VRA has taken away, and what the Supreme Court has done, taken away the federal oversight of who's doing what in those states.
Right. Well, Thomas, I think unfortunately their tools are limited. Right now, the Justice Department is first of all, they're using rhetorical strategies. Eric Holder bringing up voter ID laws in his speech over the weekend. And then secondly, from a legal perspective, quite limited now that the Supreme Court has essentially gutted the Voting Rights Act. But they're trying to, under Section 2, bring a novel legal argument and see whether that will at least work. There's also cases that have been brought by the NAACP and the ACLU in North Carolina. At this point, all they can do is try. Okay, so Ryan, let's talk about this, because former Secretary of State Colin Powell, he got a lot of attention after warning Republicans yesterday that voter ID laws are eventually just bad news in general for the party, especially if they mean that they want to attract a different set of voters by widening the tent. Take a listen.
Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, and African Americans are going to constitute a majority of the population in another generation. You say you want to reach out. You say you want to have a new message. You say you want to see if you can bring some of these voters to the Republican side. This is not the way to do it. The way to do it is to make it easier for them to vote and then give them something to vote for that they can believe in.
Ryan, do you think that's going to resonate on the right or fall on deaf ears?
Well, I do think that Colin Powell brings up an interesting point, because when we had this happening in the last cycle, you actually had so much attention on these voter ID laws that there was argumentatively it could have helped out and boosted Obama a little bit in the last election, because there was so much attention brought to these and people were very afraid of their votes being suppressed. So it'll be interesting to see where this DOJ lawsuit goes. This certainly is an interesting argument, and leaning a lot on these previous lawsuits and previous findings for who exactly is going to be disenfranchised by these future laws. All right,
so let's look forward to President Obama's speech on Wednesday, celebrating the March on Washington. And Corey, let me ask you, because Colin Powell is also calling out the president for not speaking more on race. Do you have an expectation about what you want to hear from the president, especially when it comes to celebrating this milestone in history, but also on the modern day role that race discussions in America currently stand in?
Well, Thomas, as we all know, the president has been very carefully parsed in his opportunities that he takes to address race. When it's time to address sort of the civil rights legacy and Martin Luther King's legacy, he hasn't shied from that. So I think he will jump in, as he usually does, plunges into that part of it. But the broader race discussion is something, of course, he's avoided for most of his time in office. But more recently, he's shown a willingness to wade in. Certainly we saw that with the George Zimmerman verdict with the Trayvon Martin shooting. I think on Wednesday, America is going to be looking, especially for African Americans and people of color, civil rights activists are going to be looking for the president to weigh in more clearly on issues of race. I think no matter what, though, this speech of his is going to be sort of girded under voting rights, protecting voting rights. I think he's going to lay out a very clear call that his DOJ is going to make these cases against voting rights the centerpiece of this administration's view on race and their position on race when you talk about legacy.
Ryan, do you agree with that? Because a lot of people, look at the fact that the president has been conscious of what he steps in when it comes to discussions about race, but taking into account that he's not up for re-election and doesn't have to worry about that, should the president be more forceful with the amount of time that he has left?
I think this was something that was very important to him. It's something he brought up in the State of the Union address, something he brought up on the night of his election, that, all these voting problems that we saw in the last cycle. So I definitely think it's something that's high up on his agenda, and certainly something that he talks a lot about with the Attorney General. As far as the Section 2 cases goes, I think it'll be, extremely interesting to see exactly how they're going to go about fighting these, given that the Supreme Court essentially pointed to these as a replacement for Section 5, which a lot of civil rights leaders strongly disagree with and think it doesn't offer the same protections that Section 5 really offered.
Right, Reilly, say real quickly, go ahead.
Sure, the states covered under Section 4, the structure for how exactly what states were covered under. I think that Section 5 is definitely something that really civil rights leaders are worried about weakening. All
right, we're going to have to leave it there. Ryan Reilly, Irin, Carmon, and Corey Dade, thanks so much. Appreciate your time. And for more from our panel, you can check out our website, tv.msnbc.com. Just follow the link to my name.